As you might have heard, it was recently announced that both Diablo 4 and Overwatch 2 would be delayed, which is hilarious for a pair of games that never had release dates in the first place. As it stands, no one actually knows when these titles will see the light of day. However, many are expecting sometime in 2023, as otherwise, they probably wouldn't have announced a delay at all. Overwatch 2 was first unveiled in November 2019, meaning it's now been 2 years since the announcement. In hindsight, the announcement of an Overwatch sequel marked the end of the golden years of Overwatch and ushered in a serious content drought that has continued to this day. In the golden years, the developers released 17 maps and 10 heroes, which considering their quality is a pretty impressive rate of development. However, since development effort has been poured into an Overwatch sequel, players have been left with exactly 2 maps that are exclusive to Deathmatch and 1 single hero. In a world where live service games live and die by new content being added, it's baffling that Blizzard would have fumbled its modern day golden goose, and despite the scathing criticism this game often receives, it's still the only modern multiplayer title to be a widespread Game of the Year winner since the start of the 2013 console generation. With its unmatched success, huge player base, and rabid fans, you have to wonder why Blizzard decided to develop a sequel at all, when it essentially meant putting their poster boy in stasis for several years. And to this end, I have a theory. A few years back, the executives at Activision Blizzard would announce to investors that they would be pursuing a sequel-based strategy to content going forward. In some cases, this would prove to be a good call, as a franchise like Diablo hadn't had a mainline title since 2012 and already had one of the most dedicated fan bases in gaming. These efforts would culminate in the announcement of Diablo Immortal, a mobile game that would seriously tarnish the reputation of Blizzard as a company which had historically been known for ultra-premium titles. Diablo devotees would wait an entire year before Diablo 4 was unveiled to the world, but in that time, the fan base had already been shaken.
Just was wondering, is this an out-of-season April Fool's joke?
No.
By this time, Blizzard had already been merged with Activision for around a decade, and seeing the yearly success of their Call of Duty franchise, they wondered why their other big properties couldn't enjoy the benefits of a sequel-based business model. This is where Overwatch comes into play. I suspect that at some point, the heads of the Overwatch team were told that the executives wanted a sequel, and despite the developers arguing against the idea, the Activision Blizzard heads were either too blinded by the success of Call of Duty, too busy harassing women, or preoccupied defending the use of war crimes to care. Unable to change their minds, the heads of the Overwatch team devised a plan for a quote, sequel, which would essentially be business as usual for what they would have done over the next few years, but instead of releasing the content in intervals of a few months at a time, they'd be banking it up until they believed it to be worthy of the sequel classification. The executives couldn't tell the fucking difference. The developers got to be more ambitious with some newer systems, and with the cherry on top, the sequel wouldn't be dragged down by the impending PR shitstorm the company was yet to face. Another challenge they didn't expect was a global pandemic, which according to leaks, delayed the game even further. It's not unreasonable to assume that when looking at the game's announcement 2 years ago, they had the full intention to have it released to the world as early as the end of 2020. However, when combined with COVID, getting sued by the state of California, and Jeff Kaplan leaving for greener pastures, it all proved to be a perfect storm, capable of toppling the game's once breakneck momentum. This does however beg the question of where we should go from here. If the PvP side of Overwatch 2 was always going to be free, it makes sense for the team to release the beta to the public and let feedback and player sentiment shape the competitive landscape of the franchise. There is of course an argument to be made that by doing this, it kills the hype for its eventual release of the full game as a package. However, I don't necessarily think this is accurate. It's very common that a good live service game will hit player counts much higher than its initial release, many years after first being playable. No Man's Sky is miraculously praised as being a good game after its horrendous launch. Titanfall 2 seems to enjoy a spike in players every 6 months for one reason or another, and Rainbow Six Siege started out as a very modest tactical shooter before eventually being played by a ridiculous 70 million players over the next few years. Chances are, you've probably been convinced to buy a game that's been out for several years because you've watched a video on YouTube on why it's so enjoyable. Build a great game, and they will come. It's admittedly nice to have a shiny new game with all the features stacked up and ready to go, but something that I find exponentially more exciting is the fact that the Overwatch team could decide to release their sequel in early 2022 and use their banked up content to fuel consistent hype for their game for years to come. At Blizzard's previous rate of development, they could release around 3 heroes and 3 maps every year in 4-month cycles, meaning if they kept up this rate of development since their sequel decision, they will have banked up around 8 new heroes and 8 new maps by the start of the Overwatch League next year. Assuming this is true, Overwatch 2 could launch with 1 new hero and 1 new map and commit to adding 1 of each every 2 months for 2 whole years before having to slow their release schedule. When fresh content is the lifeblood of a live service game, nothing ships units better than meaningful and frequent content updates, and for better or worse, Blizzard now find themselves in a position to maintain a steady hype and a consistent news cycle for their game for years to come. This isn't even considering the PvE aspect of their title, which will be a huge draw for the sequel in and of itself, and I can almost guarantee that by the time Overwatch 2 launches on its current trajectory, even its most loyal of players will be struggling through this long and crippling content drought. Of course, this is just me playing armchair executive for a day, but as someone who's seen one of their favorite franchises seem to cripple itself for what I can only assume to be a harebrained idea from a bunch of people who don't even play video games, I make these suggestions with the utmost concern for the health of the game and the respect for the player base. Whether or not Blizzard decides to adopt this beta approach or double down on its very long-awaited sequel is yet to be seen, but if the live service model can tell us anything, it's that no game ever comes to be judged by its very first day on the market.
Lonely, I'm Mr. Lonely.